Alright, so here's what we're dealing with. Back in late 2020, Zambia missed a single debt payment. We're talking about roughly 40 million US dollars here. That's less than what some wealthy football clubs pay for one player, one payment. And within days, the credit rating agencies downgraded the country to default status. International credit markets just shut down completely. The government couldn't borrow anymore. Hospitals couldn't get medicines. Schools couldn't pay teachers. And by 2024, millions of Zambian children were going hungry. One missed payment, one financial death sentence that triggered basically a national collapse. But here's the thing nobody tells you. Zambia didn't choose this path. The country was systematically pushed into this corner by a global financial system that was, and I want to be very clear about this, designed to make escape mathematically impossible for African countries. And the uncomfortable truth is this: Africa's poverty isn't some accident of history. It's not just about local mismanagement, it's a business model. A business model that's been running profitably for about 80 years now. One that makes institutions in New York, London, and Washington richer every single day, while keeping an entire continent trapped in what you can only call debt servitude. So in this episode, we are going to pull back the curtain on how this system got built. We are going to follow the money flowing out of Africa and see who's actually profiting from African suffering. We are going to expose 3 invisible traps, mechanisms that ensure that African nations can basically never escape. We are going to compare how Germany got messy after the Second World War, while Africa got handed a mathematical prison. And most importantly, we're going to show you how a generation of young Africans said no and what that uprising meant for the continent's future. By the end of this, you will understand something most people go their whole lives never knowing. Why a continent sitting on trillions of dollars in natural resources owes trillions in debt, and whether that reality can ever change. Let's get into it. In the summer of 1944, while Africa was still under European colonial control diplomats from about 44 nations, they gathered at a luxury hotel in New Hampshire. These were the nations winning the Second World War. These were the nations that wanted to prevent another global economic disaster. These were the nations with the power to reshape how the world works. But here was the problem. Africa wasn't in that room. Only one African nation, which was itself colonized at the time, had a seat at that table. The rest of the continent, which is hundreds of millions of people, wasn't in mineral wealth. They just watched from outside while the architects of the modern world made decisions that would control African economies for the next 80 years. Out of that conference came 2 institutions that would reshape global finance, which is the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And these institutions were created with a specific architecture. They were designed to prevent wealthy nations from experiencing financial instability. They embedded permanent voting power into the system that guaranteed Western nations, particularly the United States, could never be outvoted on major decisions. Now, where African nations gained independence in the 50s and in the 60s, they were invited to join these institutions. They were joined a system whose rules had already been written. They joined a game that favored players who would never be colonized. They joined financial architecture that was, for lack of a better word, engineered to keep them permanently subordinate. The story of Africa's debt crisis doesn't begin with African borrowing. It begins here in 1944. It begins with a table where Africa wasn't invited. It begins with a system designed before African nations even existed as independent states. And the tragedy is, 80 years later, that same system still controls whether African children eat or go hungry. It still decides whether African hospitals have medicine. It still determines whether African nations can escape or stay trapped. But the architects didn't stop at exclusion. They built three invisible trap mechanisms, so sophisticated that African leaders spent decades not even realizing they were trapped. Now, these three traps work together to make sure that the harder African nations struggle to pay off their debts, the deeper the debts they fall. The first trap is a currency weapon that destroys entire economies without firing a shot. Okay, so let me walk you through what happened in Ethiopia. In August 2024, Ethiopia's currency, which is the birr, was trading at about 56 to $1. Ordinary Ethiopians could exchange their money for dollars and at reasonable rates. Businesses could plan for the future because they knew that their currency would stay roughly stable. Then the International Monetary Fund gave Ethiopia advice: float your currency, let the market decide its value, and economic efficiency will follow. And about 15 months later, by late 2025, the birr had collapsed. The exchange rate was around 150 birr to $1. That's a depreciation of over 200% in less than a year and a half now. For Ethiopians holding debt in the US dollars, which the government had to borrow in because international leaders refused to accept payments in local currencies. This collapse meant their debt burden automatically tripled. The government hadn't borrowed more dollars. The birr had just lost its value. But mathematically, the debt had become 3 times larger, and in local terms, the consequences hit immediately. The Ethiopian government earns revenue in birr, but its debts are in dollars. When the birr collapsed, the government suddenly owed far more than it could pay. Food prices spiked because imports get paid for in dollars. Medicine prices tripled because pharmaceuticals have to be purchased in dollars. Workers' wages paid in that same depreciating birr could suddenly buy just a fraction of what they could before. And here's the trap within the trap. When the government borrowed these dollars, it was following the IMF's advice. The fund said floating the currency would improve market efficiency. What it didn't acknowledge was that floating the currency would hand control of Ethiopia's economy to currency speculators and international investors. It would guarantee that anyone who had borrowed in dollars would watch their debts explode in local terms. This isn't economic accident. This is a system working exactly as designed. When currency collapses, those who owe money in foreign currency get crushed. Those who lent money in foreign currency, which is the banks in New York, the investment funds in London, they make enormous profits from the collapse. And Ethiopia is not unique. Kenya's currency is weakening. Ghana's currency is weakening. Nigeria's currency is also weakening across the continent. Currencies are falling against the dollar, and as they fall, debts automatically grow. Without any new borrowing, it's mathematics that favors creditors over borrowers. But this currency trap is only the first mechanism. The second trap is even more sophisticated. It involves 3 companies in New York and London that control whether African nations can access credits at all. 3 companies control whether African nations can borrow money from international markets. These are the major credit rating agencies, all headquartered in New York and London. All 3 have the power to determine how much interest African nations must pay to borrow. And here's what shocks most people. One of these agencies maintains just one small office in South Africa to cover the entire sub-Saharan African region. Another has one office there. The third actually chose his only office back in 2025, and between them, these three companies have fewer than a dozen analysts physically present in Africa. Yet, their judgment determines whether Kenya pays 5% interest or 15%, whether Zambia can borrow at all, and the cost of capital for an entire continent, how much interest African nations must pay to borrow. And here's what shocks most people. One of these agencies maintains just one small office in South Africa to cover the entire sub-Saharan African region. Another has one office there. The third actually closed its only African office back in 2015. Between them, these three companies have fewer than a dozen analysts physically present in Africa. Yet, their judgment determines whether Kenya pays 5% interest or 15%, whether Zambia can borrow at all. The cost of capital for an entire continent. These companies claim to be neutral market assessors. They claim that their ratings reflect economic reality, but their methodology is full of subjective judgments. Their criteria include things like institutional capacity, external vulnerability, fiscal sustainability. These aren't numbers you can objectively measure. These are judgment calls made by analysts sitting in Manhattan and London, analysts who rarely visit the countries they are rating, making decisions that cost African nations billions of dollars. And the research is pretty clear. African countries pay roughly 1.5%, which points more in interest than countries with identical economic fundamentals. Not because African economies are worse, but because the analysts rating Africa show consistent bias. Multiply that premium across Africa's debts, we are talking about $1 trillion here. And the continent is paying billions in unnecessary interest every year. That money flows directly to creditors in wealthy nations. Consider some examples. When the government of Cameroon raised civil servant salary by a small percentage to keep up with inflation, one of these agencies rated it as a negative risk factor. When Nigeria's government challenged a downgrade decision, the agency reversed itself within several months, suggesting their original call was maybe more vulnerable to political pressure than grounded in economic analysis. And when Zambia missed that payment in late 2020, the agencies didn't just note the default, they immediately downgraded the country to restricted default status. That single decision triggered a cascade that locked Zambia out of international credit markets for years. This is gatekeeping by people who have never been to most of the countries they are judging. Financial power without accountability. Institutions making billion-dollar decisions from thousands of miles away by analysts who have never walked through an African market, spoken to African business leaders, or really understood African economic reality. The system is designed this way intentionally. The rating agencies serve as gatekeepers, determining who gets to borrow and how much they pay. They keep African nations in a constant state of financial vulnerability, and they are protected by their monopoly position. No African country can challenge them effectively because the alternative to being rated by these three is having no rating at all, which means no access to international credit. So what happens when a country falls into this gatekeeping system and credit markets shut down? When a nation misses a single payment and faces default, the answer is a catastrophe so severe that entire generations suffer for it. That's what happened to Zambia. And it shows exactly what this system does to those who fall behind. On November 13, 2020, Zambia missed a payment. The amount was modest by global standards, around $40 million. To put this in perspective, Wealthy football clubs spend more than this on a single player. I'm talking of professional athletes who earn this in just a few years. But that one missed payment triggered an economic catastrophe. And within days, the rating agencies downgraded Zambia to restricted default status. International credit markets slammed shut. Zambia couldn't borrow new money. Banks around the world stopped lending to Zambian businesses. The government faced a profound choice, which was default on its debts or cut spending on essential services. And the government was already under enormous pressure from the IMF, which had provided a loan package in return for specific conditions. Now, those conditions demanded what the fund called large front-loaded fiscal consolidation. In plain language, cut government spending dramatically and immediately, raise taxes, reduce public sector wages, eliminate subsidies on things like fuel and electricity. The most controversial condition targeted the Farm Input Support Program, or FISP. Now, this program has supported millions of Zambian small farmers since the early 2000s. It provided subsidized seeds and fertilizers, making it possible for peasant farmers to produce crops at scale. For millions of rural Zambians, this program was basically the difference between food security and hunger. The IMF demanded that FISP funding be cut dramatically from around 3% of government spending down to about 1%. The government complied in 2004. The consequences became undeniable. Zambia experienced crop failure across the entire nations. Farmers who couldn't afford seeds and fertilizers at market rates couldn't plant. Those who did saw reduced yields. Maize productions collapsed. Prices for staple foods spiked. And by mid-2024, Zambia was in acute food insecurity. The United Nations provided emergency food assistance, which is a few $million. The African Development Bank kicked in a few million more. Now, these amounts were like trying to fill an Olympic swimming pool with a garden hose. What followed was devastating. Market vendors reported empty shelves. Children showed visible signs of malnutrition. The Agriculture Ministry started distributing emergency maize with explicit warnings that recipients couldn't sell it. They couldn't use it for anything except survival. The National Farmers Union reported that government was threatening beneficiaries with blacklisting if they didn't supply crops to government purchasing agencies at below market rates. Now, the IMF didn't say cut your farm support program and accept that your children will starve. No. They said cut your farm support program to meet fiscal targets. But the famine was the foreseeable consequence. The IMF should have predicted it. Development economists working in food security did predict it. The fund recommended the policy anyway. This isn't economic theory. This isn't abstract debate. This is institutional policy that connects directly to children going hungry. A system where fiscal consolidation gets prioritized over food security. This is what happens when the goal is debt repayment rather than human welfare. And Zambia is not alone. Ghana has been in, I believe it's something like 17 different IMF programs, and over 50 years implementing nearly every recommendation, and its debt just kept growing. Senegal has sought IMF assistance more than 20 times since the late 70s. A report from the early 2000s, written by the IMF's own staff, admitted something remarkable, that economic growth under these programs, and I'm paraphrasing here, remained erratic and subdued, which in plain language means the system doesn't work, yet the same prescription gets recommended again and again. So why does the IMF keep recommending the same policies if decades of evidence show that they fail? Why are the same austerity measures demanded of every country? And why is there no flexibility? The answer involves a force operating in the shadows. While government leaders negotiate with the IMF and attention focuses on official institutions, another group holds tremendous power. Now, these are private creditors, hedge funds, investment banks, corporate bondholders who own roughly 43% of African sovereign debts, and they operate with virtually no accountability at all. Why policymakers debate the IMF and World Bank, why activists organize against austerity, another economic force operates silently in the background. Now, this force owns nearly half of African sovereign debts. The answer to no one. Government has no veto power over debt restructuring and negotiations. Now, this is the private creditor class. The private creditors include hedge funds managing billions, investment banks trading African debts, pension funds seeking returns. In Ghana's case, private creditors hold something like $17 billion in sovereign debts, more than what Ghana owes to any bilateral or multilateral lender. In Ethiopia, private creditors hold euro bonds, or I should say, international bonds dominated in foreign currency that mature at specific dates. And the fundamental problem is this. When an African country wants to restructure its debts because it simply can't pay, it has to negotiate separately with different creditor groups. Official creditor countries that have lent money, multilateral institutions like the World Bank, they have incentives to participate in restructuring because they want to maintain relationships. They have longer-term strategic interests. Private creditors have different incentives. They don't care about the country's development. They don't care whether children eat or hospitals function. They care about returns on investments. A private creditor holding a bond can just hold out, refuse to participate, wait to see if the country somehow finds money to pay them back. The system provides no mechanism to compel private creditors to participate in restructuring. This creates a game where private creditors can sit back and watch. Official creditors negotiate with the government, offer relief, accept some losses, but private creditors refuses to participate or demand better terms than the official creditors got. The result is that restructuring takes years. Countries remain in limbo. Now borrowing becomes impossible. Economic activity declines. Ethiopia spent years negotiating its debt restructuring. The country requested a comprehensive restructuring in early 2001 under the G20's common framework. It wasn't until mid-2025 that Ethiopia finally reached an agreement with official creditors on restructuring over $8 billion in debt. Then came the hardest part, negotiating with private creditors. By early 2026, Ethiopia reached a preliminary agreement with private creditors. But the terms revealed just how much power these creditors have. Ethiopia had to accept a haircut, a reduction in the debt of only about 15%. That's remarkably low. Ethiopia's debt is unsustainable. The country can't repay. Yet, private creditors negotiated Ethiopia down to accepting only a 15% loss. Why? Because private creditors have no incentive to accept losses. They can hold out. They can refuse until the borrowing country gets desperate enough to accept whatever terms they demand. This system is the opposite of fair. Multilateral lenders sometimes take substantial losses in restructuring. Private creditors can just wait. The result is that countries are held hostage to investment funds and hedge managers who have no relationship to the borrowing country beyond wanting financial return. This is where African pain becomes Wall Street profits, where hunger in Zambia connects to bonuses in Manhattan, where currency collapse in Ethiopia becomes investment opportunity for London hedge funds. The system is designed so that African suffering is monetized. Pain becomes a commodity. Hunger becomes an investment opportunity. But even this system, the rating agencies, the currency manipulation, and the private creditor operates within a larger framework. And that framework was built 80 years ago, deliberately designed to ensure African subordination. It survived wars, independent movements, African leaders, countless reform attempts. And to understand why it survived, we need to go back to the original moment when the trap was laid. In July 1944, roughly 70 years before Kenya's youth stormed parliament, and before Zambia defaulted, before Ethiopia's currencies collapsed, delegates from about 44 nations gathered at a hotel in New Hampshire. The war in Europe was ending. The war in the Pacific was winding down. The war's victorious powers wanted to make sure the financial chaos that led to the Great Depression would never happen again. They created two institutions, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. This would manage global finance, provide emergency loans to countries in crisis, coordinate international economic policy. But in designing these institutions, the architects made a choice about power. They could have created democratic institutions where each nation had equal votes. Instead, they created institutions where voting power was based on financial contributions. The more money a nation puts in, the more votes it got. The United States, having emerged from the war as the dominant economic power, had contributed the most. The US got the most votes, something like 16–17%. That gave the United States effective voting power over any decision requiring a supermajority. And Europe, devastated by war, received favorable voting allocations. These nations were seen as crucial to rebuilding Western civilization. Africa wasn't consulted. Africa wasn't at the table. Dozens of sub-Saharan African countries representing over 1 billion people in vast mineral wealth would later be represented by just 2 executive directors on the IMF board. Imagine 1 billion people having influence comparable to 2 voices in a room full of dozens. When African nations gained independence and joined these institutions, they entered a system whose rules had already been written. They couldn't change the voting structure. They couldn't demand equal representation. They couldn't reshape the institutions to serve African interests. They could only participate within the framework that had been built without them. And here's where the system's true cruelty becomes visible. Compare how Germany was treated after the Second World War to how African nations were treated after independence. Germany had lost a devastating war. They owed money to every nation it had fought. Its economy was in ruins. Yet, in early 1953, the Allied powers signed an agreement on German external debts, and that agreement was remarkable. Germany was allowed to repay in its own currencies, the Deutschmark. It wouldn't have to repay in dollars. It had to earn through exports. Germany was allowed to service its debt using no more than about 5% of its export revenues. The remaining 95% could have been used for development, purchasing imports, rebuilding the nation. But Germany received a preferential interest rate capped at around 5%, not market rates, which would have been much higher. Germany got room to breathe. Germany got flexibility. Germany got conditions that recognized it needed time to rebuild. And Germany got these terms because it mattered to Western security. Germany was wealthy. Germany was white. Germany was strategically important. Now contrast this with what African nations received when they sought assistance from these same institutions. African nations were required to borrow in foreign currency, dollars, euros, pounds, and their own currencies weren't accepted. When those currencies collapsed, and they inevitably did under pressure from speculators, the debt burden automatically increased. There was no cap on debt services. African nations could be forced to spend 30, 40, or even 50% of their export revenues servicing debts. There were no preferential rates. African nations borrowed at market rates, several times higher than what the US pays, many times higher than what Germany paid. And the conditions attached to African loans demanded immediate austerity. No gradual reconstruction, no room to build. Immediate fiscal consolidation, immediate subsidy cuts, immediate privatization of state enterprises, immediate adoption of neoliberal economic models. The contrast isn't subtle. It reveals who the system was designed to help and who it was designed to control. Now, back in 1961, Ghana's first president warned about what was coming. He understood the financial architecture being built. He wrote that it would be a tragedy if the weakness of newly independent African nations led to a new foreign domination, and this time through economic forces. He saw the trap being laid. He understood these institutions weren't designed to develop Africa, but to ensure Africa's continued subordination. And by 2025, his warning had become prophecy. African countries in debt distress or at high risk had grown from around 19 in 2023 to 36 by late 2025. The system was working exactly as designed, extracting wealth, preventing development, maintaining independence. But here's the part the architects never anticipated. They assumed African nations would comply indefinitely. They assumed the debt traps was inescapable. They didn't anticipate what will happen when a generation of young Africans, digital natives, connected across borders, educated but economically excluded, decided the contract was void. On June 25, 2024, something remarkable happened in Nairobi, Kenya. Thousands of young Kenyans, students, nurses, office workers, motorcycle taxi riders, security guards, surrounded their own parliament building. They climbed walls, pushed through gates, entered the chambers where elected leaders usually deliberate in isolation. No generals, no tanks, no military takeover, just ordinary young people who had reached the breaking point. What triggered this was a finance bill. The bill proposed a value-added tax on bread, taxes on digital content, levies on eco-friendly vehicles. Now, these seemed like modest tax increases, abstract fiscal policy, but young Kenyans understood what these taxes really meant. They understood that their government was indebted to the IMF. They understood the 2021 loan package demanded that Kenya raise revenue and cut spending. They understood that the finance bill was designed to meet those conditions. They understood, in other words, that this bill wasn't really written by Kenya's elected leaders. It was designed by institutions in Washington. The response was organized through digital platforms. A hashtag emerged, Reject Finance Bill 2024. That hashtag was viewed, I think, something like 750 million times, millions of engagements, hundreds of thousands of unique users, coordinating resistance across Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Telegram. Young Kenyans used AI tools to translate the complex finance bill into local languages so that ordinary people could understand what was being proposed. Activists leaked the phone numbers of members of parliament so that youths could send mass messages demanding rejections. Content creators made viral videos explaining the IMF's role. Memes spread mocking government leaders. The movement was leaderless. decentralized, coordinated entirely through social media. And by mid-June, the digital uprising had hit the streets. Protests in Nairobi, Kisumu, Mombasa, Nakuru, Eldoret. Young people faced police with tear gas and live ammunition. They were beaten, some were killed, but they continued. Signs reading the president must go, IMF must go home, tax the rich, leave the hustlers, protest songs, murals, live streams of confrontations with police, making sure the world was watching. And in early July 2024, Kenya's president announced the dismissal of his entire cabinet except one minister. On the surface, a dramatic retreat, a government responding to the will of the people. But the underlying conditions had not changed. Kenya's debt kept mounting. And by late 2025, Kenya's total public debt had reached something like $90 billion, around two-thirds of GDP. The students had won a symbolic victory. The structural debt trap remained. Yet something had shifted. The uprising wasn't isolated. Across the continent, young people were watching, learning, connecting, and in early 2026, Zambia withdrew its request for a one-year extension of its IMF program. No official explanation given, but observers read it as a signal. Zambia asserting independence, saying it no longer accepted the terms being demanded. Around the same time, Ghana's president declared his nation's current IMF program would be its 17th and its last. He committed that Ghana would never again seek bailout funds from the fund. The African Union was convening debt conferences. The Pan-African Organization was pushing for a complete reset of global financial architecture, and plans were developing for an African credit rating agency so that African countries wouldn't depend on American and British firms to judge their credit worthiness. Plans for an African monetary fund so that African nations could provide emergency assistance to each other without conditions, and plans for the African Continental Free Trade Area to actually become operational so that African nations could trade with each other rather than being dependent on wealthy nations. The system was designed to be permanent, engineered to absorb resistance and keep extracting wealth. But in June 2024, something broke. Young Africans stopped asking permission from institutions they never invited to their table. They stopped negotiating with systems designed to suppress them. They declared that the contracts, the 80-year-old financial agreement drawn up without Africans' participation, void. The system is counting on you, not realizing that possibility. It's betting African nations will stay trapped indefinitely, assuming the debt burden is inescapable. But the events of 2024 and 2025 suggest something different. They suggest a generation that grew up with smartphones and global connectivity, and they understand that the world can be different. They understand debt isn't destiny. They understand another Africa is possible, and most importantly, they are willing to fight for it. This is Frontline Briefing Desk. If you value truth unfiltered and power refrained from an African lens, subscribe, like, and drop your thoughts. My name is P. Solomon, and I'll see you in the next video.